Emma, at the end of this, if you can forward me the list of attendees that actually attended. I know we had something like 60 or 70 people sign up, but not to say that all of them will come.
Yeah, I can pull that at the end and then send that to you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Looks like we've got a few people that have joined already. I'll just give anyone else a few minutes to join still. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for joining the webinar. I know it's well, good afternoon, should I say? Yeah, it's 12:01. We've got a fair amount of attendees now, and I know there'll be some more joining as we keep going. We do have a large topic to discuss and a large amount of content. So without any delay, what we'll do is we'll start off a little bit slowly, and we'll give other participants a chance to come in. And what I'll do is we'll start by just introducing myself, and we'll slowly dive into to the objective and the topics at hand. So today the presentation is on navigating the evolving regulatory landscape for radon in Canada. And so my name is Alexander Taillon. I am a radon measurement and mitigation professional. I'm also certified to design rough-in systems in new construction. I'm a radiation safety officer here at Pynchon, and I sit on the board of directors for CARST. That is the Canadian Association for Radon Scientists and Technologists, which governs and supports professionals in the industry. Finally, I'm the national practice leader for radon at Pynchon, where I work with clients and our project teams from across the country in nearly every province on testing for radon, mitigation for construction or for concentrations that are elevated, and design of roughing components into new builds. On a personal level, that is a photograph of me and my family, and we live here in the GTA. When work allows me to, I travel all over Canada. If I'm not with my family, then I'm outdoors, and I love spending time outside. So today's presentation, we're going to cover some particularly, maybe not particularly exciting topics, but nonetheless very important. And depending on where you are or which sector you're in, this information may impact you quite differently. So the objective of this presentation is to provide you an overview of the recent and upcoming changes to, and we'll start with the building codes. More particularly, we'll quickly go over the BC building code that was published earlier this year in March of 2024. We'll take a look at some of the upcoming changes to the Ontario Building Code, which is set to harmonize with the 2020 National Building Code of Canada. And we'll take a look at the new 2025 National Building Code of Canada, which is also set to be released late next year or early next year, and we'll see how that impacts us. We'll take a look at the Canadian General Standards Board standard, as well as the Canada Labour Code and the changes to harmonize with Health Canada. We'll also take a look at Health Canada's guidance, and more specifically, the residential guidance. Now, I've been putting off this presentation for the last few months, waiting for the changes to the Canada Labour Code to be made. It was expected for earlier this year, but like all things in government, it takes time. So, nonetheless, it's important to stay up to date with regulatory changes and to ensure compliance and best practice in the management of radon. It is important to prepare ourselves for the changes that are coming. So, without further ado, we'll dive right in. So we'll start with the building code updates, and although there have been many changes, we'll focus on the big changes and those pertaining specifically to the radon industry. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, when I'm talking about building codes, I'll be talking about new construction. I understand building codes applies to building additions and alterations and changes of use, but in order not to overcomplicate this presentation in the limited amount of time that we have, we'll specifically be talking about new construction. So before diving into these codes, let's just state some of the obvious as an introduction. The National Building Code of Canada, or the NBCC, is developed by the National Research Council of Canada. The most recent edition is the 2020 National Building Code, and these are typically updated every 5 years. The NBCC provides the fundamental model, and until each province and territory adopts it, it technically has no legal status. It can often take several years to be adopted, but in the meantime, it gives us all a good preview of codes to come. On the other hand, provincial and territorial building codes are legal requirements by the governing bodies to regulate design and construction of buildings. Province and territories in Canada are responsible for adopting and enforcing building codes. While many use the NBCC as a base, each province and territory can make their own modifications to meet the local requirements. Enforcement of the building codes are carried out by the local and municipal authorities, typically through a building permit stage and through inspections of the construction. In some provinces like Ontario, municipalities are allowed to go above and beyond the provincial building code. Whereas in other provinces like Manitoba, for instance, municipalities have no such capabilities and they must follow the province. So further, what we will be discussing for much of the building code updates is readily remediated new construction, or RRNC. This is the components of a radon mitigation system which are designed into the plans for a new build and incorporated into the construction. These are often called rough-in radon components or just rough-ins for simplicity. These provisions are designed to ensure that the building has the infrastructure in place to manage radon levels if they're found to be high afterwards. The building code requirements primarily focus on the design and installation of radon rough-in components during the construction phase. The advantage of these systems is when installed properly, they can maximize the airflow underneath the concrete foundation. Using a system, a small system, you can move air underneath a 20,000 square foot building. And I've seen as much as 100,000 square foot building with one system in certain areas. So these can be integrated into the design. They require minimal effort to activate. You can optimize the positioning where required or where needed. You can conceal them, you can protect them, and often at minimal upfront costs. Material costs are small, the labor is already on site, and you can often piggyback it with other trades. So we'll start by talking about the British Columbia Building Code, which now applies to projects after March 10th of 2024. Some of the changes we see in the BC include new requirements related to rough-ins. The first big update was to eliminate the exemption for certain areas in British Columbia for these rough-in requirements. Unless buildings now have a specifically designed alternative protection from radon, new builds across the province are now required to provide a rough-in system. Note that these changes only apply to Part 9 of the building code. So it applies specifically to housing and small buildings, regardless of the location or the occupancy classification or the time that you occupy a building within that province. Many of the changes will follow the Canadian General Standards Board, which we'll go over in a few slides. But these include an air barrier system, continuously dividing the conditioned space from the ground, installed below the building foundation. Below that is a gas permeable layer installed below that air barrier to facilitate airflow underneath the building. There's a stack pipe as vertical as possible, exhausting through the roof. And these stack pipes are minimum 4-inch diameter, Schedule 40 piping. The exhaust must be fitted with a wire mesh to prevent animals and rodents from going into that space. The idea is that these systems are passive radon mitigation systems. They must be labeled, and there must be consideration for future installation of a fan on these systems. So the Building and Safety Standards branch of BC quoted the following: the building code does not require an active subfloor depressurization system or a fan installed. However, it can be prudent to install one as part of a new house build. Interestingly, a sidewall exhaust is allowed, but it must be part of an active system, which means it must have a fan installed, and it must be installed by a trained radon mitigation professional to do so. So as a builder in BC, these changes will affect you. It's estimated that the additional costs from the installation of these rough-in components is generally less than $1,000, whereas the cost of installing a mitigation system thereafter construction can range anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000, depending on building criteria. Now moving over to Ontario a little bit, the Ontario Building Code requirements for rough-ins currently apply primarily to designated high radon areas. Existing buildings and those located not in high-risk zones may not be required. In the OBC, section 9.13.4.1 specifically states where methane or radon gases are known to be a problem. And then further in section 9.1.1.7, it identifies 3 such areas where that is a known problem, where these rough-in systems are required. When constructing in Ontario, though, it is prudent to check with the local municipalities. Like I mentioned above, in Ontario, municipalities are allowed to go above and beyond the provincial building code. And some are doing just that to include their regions. Here are some of the municipalities that have implemented their own radon programs that go above and beyond the Ontario Building Code. Note that these are not the only municipalities, and we're seeing a lot more of these join the list every few months. The region of Niagara Falls, for instance, which includes over 20 different municipalities, made it mandatory in June for all residential new buildings. The city of Guelph has made it mandatory for all new construction for several years now, and they've been at the forefront of these changes. A lot of municipalities in the area of Guelph have actually followed their program and followed their leadership. The city of Milton most recently required rough-in systems for a residential complex in the area. And other municipalities like Hamilton or Prince Edward County or Kingston are making similar asks for public buildings like schools and hospitals and government buildings. So it's important, and I emphasize the importance of checking if you're building in these regions or if you're building in Ontario, to check with your local municipality. Each program, although similar, may have variations, and you really don't want to get shocked during the building permit stages. So that is current situation here in Ontario. One of the big upcoming changes is Ontario is set to release the 2024 Ontario Building Code. Actually, it has released it already in advance to ease the transition. It comes into effect January 1st, 2025. It's important to note that this version now consolidates with the National Building Code of Canada, the 2020 version, which has been out for the last 4+ years. As a side note for other provinces on the call, before I continue with Ontario, the 2020 National Building Code is already applicable in most provinces except for Ontario, which is lagging behind the group. Although there are a few regional specific parts of PEI and Newfoundland that have not quite jumped on yet, and Quebec, but Ontario is the big one lagging behind. So what does this mean for you? The changes will first and foremost remove the regional and municipal limitations in Ontario, at which point all new construction in Ontario, which falls under Part 9 of the Building Code, will be required to incorporate rough-in systems into their design and construction. Note that these requirements are similar to BC in that they include an air barrier below the concrete slab, a permeable layer below that to allow airflow underneath the foundation, and a means to connect into it, so a piping network that connects the permeable layer to the conditioned space. That pipe has to be capped and sealed and labeled. Note that these systems, specifically in Ontario, are capped, which greatly differs from BC, so that these systems do not need to be exhausting at roof level. So what is included within the National Building Code of 2020? Well, the granular drainage layer, which speaks to a continuous layer of crushed stone below the building foundation. Most commonly, this is 3/4 inch clear stone. The air barrier must provide a continuous barrier to air leaks to minimize the ingress of soil gases into that conditioned space. Rough-in pipes, which are open to the granular layer and end in the conditioned space above, again capped and sealed. And sump pits must be airtight. Now, it's important to state that these measures outlined in the National Building Code 2020 are a minimum standard that builders must meet. The General Standards Board has developed a best practice document called Radon Control Options in New Buildings. This document is free to review and download online and provides the best practices so that builders can go above and beyond during design and construction. Examples of some of these recommendations include The proper sealing practice of the building foundation. This includes the perimeter to wall joints, cold joints, saw cuts, cracking that happen during the curing of the concrete slabs. Consideration for pipe path and exhaust of a future system. So consideration for where the fan is going to be, where the system will exhaust in the future, electrical requirement of fan, proper labeling and sealing techniques of the pipes in more detail, and no solid pipes below the slab. So utilizing perforated pipes to maximize the area or the coverage of that system below the foundation to allow or maximize that airflow of the system. These are examples of some of the projects that I've worked on recently. In the top left, we have pictures of membranes that are laying across the entire footprint of the building. These are sealed and inspected for leaks prior to the pour of the concrete. We also see in the bottom left the complexity and the sheer quantity of some of these sub-slab pipe networks below the foundation. This can sometimes be a labyrinth to navigate. And so the importance of having these radon roughened pipes strategically placed, all the more important. The advantages of designing these systems into the construction is also the placement and the positioning of these pipes and exhaust systems into or hiding them and protecting these systems into the building. In the bottom right-hand side is a project we recently worked on. It was a school in Hamilton where every room on that ground floor had strip footings. And so although the client wasn't particularly pleased at the R&C requirements of this system, they certainly understood the importance of it if radon concentrations were high, and the need for pipes or perforated pipes to traverse these strip footings to maximize the area of a radon mitigation system if the radon concentrations were to be high. So the National Research Council of Canada has finalized the latest version of the 2025 National Building Code. From what I understand, they have finished all public reviews except for one. They have one last meeting in October, after which, if it is accepted, it's set to be released for January 1st, 2025. What's more is that although this release is not legally standing until each province and territory adopts it, in the past, it's meant that, like Ontario, it can take up to 5 years to adopt. But in the last few years, each province has signed onto an agreement whereby now all provinces must harmonize with the 2025 Building Code, National Building Code, within 18 months of the published date. So they can choose to adopt it as is or with amendments to suit the province. This means that all provinces must adopt this by no later than June of 2026. Some provinces, like British Columbia, may not quite be impacted by these changes, considering they are well above and beyond the current requirements of the National Building Code. But let's see what some of these changes look like for you in other provinces. For one, the big one, is the proposed change 1993. This proposed change includes a requirement for the installation of a passive stack for a sub-slab depressurization system currently or during the initial construction. It is to apply to dwellings and home-type care buildings. The conditions for these systems are described in great detail and are referenced in the CGSB, as well as resemble greatly what the BC Building Code is doing. It's a vertical pipe terminating at the roof, minimizing horizontal length, acting as a passive radon mitigation system. It shall be protected in the conditioned space, insulated in an unconditioned space, and it shall have a wire mesh or a vermin guard at the exhaust. So you can see within the next 2 years how these passive systems are going to be in all new builds in Canada. Again, that's new builds for dwellings and home type care buildings. The material cost impact for these are estimated at, again, approximately $1,000, likely much less per building. Now, for builders that are constructing homes in crawl spaces, these next two changes might affect you more, or should I say homes with crawl spaces. Right now, the NBCC 2020, in the NBCC 2020, it can be argued that sealing air barriers underneath the concrete slab is not required. Although it's not the intent of the code, it has been argued that the weight of the concrete and the drying of it on a membrane can act as a clamping along the length of a joint in the membrane. The proposed changes to the NBCC now requires that these membranes be lapped no less than 10 centimeters and that these are sealed with flexible sealant. The material cost from this is as low as $50 for the cost of a sealant. And considering that the current National Building Code already requires perimeter sealing and perimeter or penetrations to be sealed, the only large change here is the impact on the membrane and the sealing of those joints between the seams. The final large change again applies to crawl spaces. And the problem is the ground covers have been shown, these are air barriers in crawl spaces, have been shown to balloon up during normal operation of the building. And if that barrier fails, it may allow soil gases to enter that conditioned space. So the proposed change is to define and quantify how to weigh down these barriers. The cost impact of this, again, is about $1.50 to $2 per square meter of material costs. So on a small building, the additional material cost can be a few $100s. Now, considering we are doing well on time, before I jump off of the topic of building codes and on to the more anticipated Canada Labor Code, does anyone have any questions with respects to the building codes and the topics discussed so far? Okay. There will be a question period at the very end, and we'll have an opportunity there as well. So part 10 of the Canadian or the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations under the Canada Labor Code currently require that federally regulated employees not be exposed to more than 800 becquerels per cubic meter of radon on average over a given year in the workplace. This has not been consistent with Health Canada's guidance for a very long time. So Health Canada, in consolidation with the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Radiation Protection Committee, has proposed that the threshold for acceptable levels of radon be reduced from 800 to 200, harmonizing that with Health Canada and NORM guidelines. This is largely due to scientific studies that conclusively linked the risk of developing lung cancer to radon. Health Canada also recognizes during this difficult decision that other jurisdictions around the world, including Australia, China, Germany, and UK, have already set their exposure limits to 200. So when I speak to colleagues or my colleagues or clients alike about the changes that are coming to the Canada Labor Code, I often get asked one of three questions. First is, how will this impact me? Well, first and foremost, this change will affect federal employees and federal workplaces specifically. So if you are a federally regulated, like banks, telecommunications, energy, air and rail transportation, First Nations or Crown corporations, etc., this will impact you. And if you're a property manager or a landlord to federal employees, this will also impact you. Pynchon has recently completed some testing for one of our clients, which is federally regulated, in anticipation of the proposed changes coming to the Canada Labour Code. In this project, approximately 1,000 buildings were tested over the course of several years. The results of these tests indicated 2 buildings were above the action limit of 800 and required mitigation. But when this action limit is reduced to 200, that changes to approximately 80 buildings of theirs that now require mitigation. That's over 8% of their buildings. It's important to consider that this harmonizing of the action limit with Health Canada can significantly impact your portfolios and may affect many more buildings than previously thought. Today, it's no longer about being proactive, it's about being prepared. So let's return to the question, how is this going to impact you? Well, have you started testing your buildings for radon? If not, have you considered the cost of testing and the availability of resources to do so when this service will be required and in high demand? At this time, there's still a lot of federal clients out there that have not tested their buildings. So what happens when they all decide to test at the same time? Have you considered the impacts on your budget associated with the testing? Considering that pre-COVID, a particular building here in the GTA would have cost $2,500 to test, where now the costs may have increased as much as 20 or even 40%, depending on the building type. How about the remediation of some of these buildings? Know that the costs of mitigation vary significantly based on a lot of factors like building type, occupancy, location, HVAC systems. And there are very limited qualified professionals at this time across Canada. I won't get too deep into the risks associated with liability involved if someone were to get sick as a result of radon in the workplace. But know that every year we see more and more public awareness about radon and the health risks associated with it. Whereas 10 years ago, we had less than 5% of Canadians know what radon was. Now the statistics are closer to 40% of Canadians. All it takes is one person, one employee, one occupant calling out your property to the Ministry of Labour, getting you as a property manager or an employer or landlord flagged. But let's consider the advantages of a proactive, staggered approach to testing a building portfolio over several years. First and foremost, the reduced upfront costs. By spreading out the radon testing over many years, businesses can avoid the high upfront costs associated with testing all of their spaces or all their properties at once. Many of our clients have started by doing pilot programs, testing a handful of the worst case buildings to get their feet wet instead of diving right in. Sustained financial planning. So staggering the testing allows for better budgeting over the years, keeping cash flows consistent rather than experiencing a financial strain in a single year. Our clients from the previous example here set a particular budget every year. They set aside a particular budget every year. And depending on the results of the prior phase, that budget would be portioned out either towards measurement of new buildings or the mitigation of the previously tested. Operational efficiencies. So testing portfolios spread over multiple years allows for a better distribution of resources. And that's largely in terms of manpower, but also equipment. So radon testing can be an intense process, depending on the building types that you have. It requires special personnel and equipment to test, and staggering these ensures that the availability of those resources without overburdening your teams. Consider that there's a limited window of testing and that these buildings must be tested in the heating season for a duration of 91 days. So that leaves a very small window, about 3 to 4 months, to get your detectors deployed. The time for remediation. So by testing smaller portions over time, organizations can address remediation more effectively. Again, in our previous example, our client decided to complete their mitigation over phases, allowing them to better cost manage and timely manage those mitigation procedures. And finally, the public perception, to demonstrate to your staff, to your clients, and to your public that you are proactive in light of the upcoming changes, that you are committed to the health and safety of the people within your buildings. So, second question I often get asked is, will testing be required? These are two excerpts from the Canada Gazette where the proposed changes were made, and the public review was completed back in October of 2023. The language in the Gazette paints a clear picture where in the over the next 20 years, it's estimated that 25,000 workplaces will require testing. Similarly, in the second paragraph, 20 or just under 24,000 workplaces will undergo radon testing. In subsequent years, this falls into an average of 90 buildings annually, as only new workplaces will be required to test. So the language does paint a clear picture. In conversations with many Health Canada staff involved with the development of these changes at the COST conference earlier this year, they were under the impression that the language was very clear towards testing. As an aside, let's consider the requirements for testing on a public level. In Ontario, let's remember that the language is already set very clear for us. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, under the General Duty Clause, it's very clear that an employer shall take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to protect its worker. And those hazards, and that includes hazards associated with exposure to radon. Further, they cite NORM directly, and that is the Naturally Occurring Radioactive Materials Guidance. And they cite that directly to recommend that all workplaces be assessed with radon, and that action limit is 200. Further, we keep in mind that in other provinces, in nearly every province, public health has acknowledged radon as a health risk, and that CAREX, Carcinogen Exposure Canada, has identified radon as a level 1 carcinogen. That is the highest level of risk for, the highest risk for cancer. They estimate that the risk of dying from radon is approximately 20,000 times higher than your risk of dying from asbestos or asbestosis. The final question I get asked is, when is this happening? The truth is, Health Canada, in collaboration with the government, has been talking about making these changes for many years now, thus giving opportunity for businesses to complete the testing proactively. And many have. The government estimates that about 50% of federally regulated public buildings have, but there's no such estimates on privately regulated federal workplaces. Thus, many of the delays that we've seen over the last few years, not just from COVID, have been so that the government can also complete the testing of their own buildings, in a way to get their ducks in a row. The proposed changes were put into Gazette for public review back in October of 2023. The question period lasted about 30 days, and the changes were originally expected to be published back in the spring of 2024. Now, the latest updates directly from Health Canada expect it to be published later this fall, 2024. In this slide is the full name of that amendment, Part 1, Volume 157, Number 43, by which anyone can search the Government of Canada website for regular updates and publishings. And you'll see from those latest editions that these publishings happen quite often. So as the month of August wraps up and we're approaching the next heating season, this may very well be your last chance to test before the changes are accepted and amended in the Canada Labour Code. Finally, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but this is the last update. And this is with respect to Health Canada's residential guidance. So at the annual CARS conference earlier this year, Health Canada shared that they plan to make some updates to the residential guidance document for the fall of 2024. I have no doubt that some of these will trickle into the public domain over time as well. So this will be a good precursor to what to expect as well on the public sector. But most notable of these changes include the detector placements. A lot of the current instructions for the placement of detectors is based on outdated information and technology that is no longer readily used, such as charcoal detectors and e-perm testing devices. Some of the instructions, such as detectors should not be placed in direct sunlight or moist areas or on electronic surfaces, these are going to be revisited. Health Canada admits that the instructions are a little too restrictive and they should be made easier for testing. Mitigation timelines, so post-testing. A lot of recent data indicates that if homeowners do not mitigate their homes within the first year after receiving the results, the likelihood of proceeding to mitigation is reduced drastically. So surveys show that if they have 2 years to do it, they'll likely put it off and forget about it. So this is where Health Canada has indicated that they're revisiting the mitigation timelines. Those recommendations for 2 years over 200 and 1 year over 600, hinting that they may simplify the recommendations to just 1 year. And finally, the last update is with respect to electron radon monitors. With the speed of technology these days, there have been huge quantity of electronic radon monitors flooding the market on websites like Amazon. And many of these devices don't go through proper testing. They do not get approved, and they provide false readings and false information to purchasers and clients. So Health Canada is investigating these and issuing recalls. But finding that the time they have, by the time they've finished their investigation, vendors have already changed the look, they've changed the name of these devices, and already relisted them back on these providers. So anyone looking to provide or to purchase electron monitors should reference the CNRPP website and their list of approved devices. We are ahead of schedule, but here is a recap of some of the updates. So the BC Building Code of 2024 took effect March 10th, 2024. This now requires passive systems in all homes and small buildings within the province of British Columbia. The Ontario Building Code 2024 is harmonizing with the National Building Code 2020 on January 1st, 2025. That now requiring roughing components into, again, small buildings and homes as of January 1st. These are roughing systems capped at the building foundation at a minimum. The National Building Code of Canada 2025 is set to be released in January and must be adopted by all provinces and territories within 18 months. So this National Building Code updates will require passive stack systems, again, in all dwellings and home care buildings. The Canadian General Standards Board standard of 2024 was released back in June, just a few months ago, and provides best practice in the industry. The Canada Labour Code is set to harmonize the radon exposure limit with Health Canada's guidance and norm this fall of 2024, And finally, the last update, Health Canada's residential guidance document is projected to be updated this fall, 2024. So we did finish a little bit in advance or ahead of schedule, which leaves some time for questions. So first question, wasn't 200 becquerels per meter cube was for an exposure time of 16 hours. Would this make the limit for houses even less? Brad, I'm not sure where that 16 hours is coming from. I haven't quite seen that before. So if you'd like, you can reach out to me after the call, provide me with that information. I'd be happy to sit down with you and discuss that. Are there any Toronto regulations that are different than the Ontario Building Code? In Toronto, I'm not aware of any specific requirements for roughing systems specifically. It's one of those municipalities that is lagged behind others in the province. Although I have seen it, certain builders have put it into townhouses and residential buildings here in the GTA. I don't know that it's such required at the moment. But come January 1st of next year, it will be. What is the impact on the commercial leases in BC if radon levels are above 200? What is the impact on commercial leases? Sorry, Milan, I'm not sure what you mean by commercial leases there. Will Health Canada be updating their guidance for radon measurement in public buildings? So that was updated, I believe, just recently. I think it was last year. So I don't expect them to update that public guidance again for another few years. Zana, other than in BC, are there regulations outlining radon safety-related landlord responsibilities for commercial buildings, federal or provincial? That is a tricky question, and that will largely depend on the lease or the contract document between the landlord and the tenant or the occupants of that building. The responsibility may fall on the tenant or the employer or the occupants within that space, or it may fall within the landlord. I've seen both. And that's why it's important to review that contract with or between two parties. In some cases, it may be the responsibility of the federal employer or the federal employees within that workspace, but it may fall under the landlord or the property manager. Again, I urge you to review that document. Can you exit your lease if the radon levels are too high? That I cannot answer for you. That is something I think you would have to discuss with your legal team. Brad, Health Canada's guidance for radon measurement in public buildings states that hospitals, long-term care home, correction facilities are occupied continuously. So for long-term 3-month measurements should be conducted an estimate of radon exposure to the occupants. However, most schools, so we're talking about the occupied exposure limits here. So Health Canada's guidance does have occupied exposure limits, whereby you may consider the time for which the occupants are within the building. That is an acceptable level. It has been shown as an example within schools, and it has been applied to public buildings, although I've never seen it applied to residential buildings. So I'm assuming this is part of your earlier question. With homes, although many of us do work from the office, some of us work from home. Some of us occupy our homes for 24 hours a day. So I don't know that that would apply to homes, but it certainly applies to public buildings, and that approach may be taken in consideration when you're examining or when you're determining the exposure to public buildings. I hope that answers your question, Brad. Would radon pipe caps have different colors than plumbing roughing caps? That's a good question. So best practice right now, and again, there's no requirement for this, but best practice does recommend that these pipes be of different color and be clearly distinguishable from other pipes within construction. Now, it is required that these pipes be labeled and identified as components of radon rough-in systems, but the different colors is a recommendation at this point, again, in the CGSB. So, not a requirement at this time. Okay. So if there are no other questions, I do encourage you to reach out to me if you have any future or other questions that come up afterwards. And then I would be happy to sit with you and discuss. So thank you everyone for your time. Enjoy your lunch, what's left of it, and have a good day.